Hello, this is Paul Chapman and welcome to another one of my Sabbath Bible lesson video teacher's aids for teachers of the Sabbath Bible lesson. Now, this is the adult Sabbath school lesson that we're doing this quarter at the Light of the World. By the way, this is part 1 of 4 lessons for this quarter, all entitled The Light of the World, and is dealing with the theme of evangelism. And we're going to be looking this week at lesson number 3, Joseph in Egypt. Now, firstly, my apologies that I haven't kept up with the first 2 lessons. I hope to catch up with those in the near future, and I'll upload the video teacher's aids for those 2. But even though the lesson has passed, but just for the sake of continuity, I'll upload those 2 as I get a chance. The reason I've been delayed with that, we've had end-of-year conferences, seminars, administration. Now that's all over, I've got a chance to get back into things, and so let's do that with this week's lesson, Joseph in Egypt. So now, if you've been following through the videos, you'll know that what this series is for primarily is for teachers of the adult Sabbath school lesson quarterlies. Now, if you're not a teacher, you may be just a student, that's great. I'm sure you'll get something out of this as well. Now, the method we're using in teaching of the lesson is not just to read through the lesson each day, the question, read the Bible verse and read the note. That's not teaching the lesson, and that's what I don't want you to be doing. What we want to be able to do is what I call come up with an outline of the lesson, a teaching plan for the lesson, where you have a main point of the lesson, you have what we call a macro point or main point, supporting that point with micro points, and then summarising them back to the macro point, and then making a personal and practical application of the lesson to the students in your class for that week. Now, we call this the macro, micro, macro principle. So another part of that same method is also, not part of it, but rather is a help. I don't know if this will be helpful for you, but it is for me, and that is the markup that I'm using in my lesson to help me as I'm going through, just to hone in on the main points. So, for example, here we have the asterisk meaning a new concept, the arrow a personal need, the plus symbol of personal help, and the asterisk something the class should understand. And I use the asterisk, rather the hash symbol, something the class should understand. Now, I use the hash symbol quite a bit in my lesson because that enables me, as you can see just there, it enables me to hone in on that day's lesson and the points that I want to bring out for the class for that day. Particularly if I'm running short of time, maybe it's 20 minutes, 20 minutes is gone, I'm only up to Wednesday's lesson, at least, or rather Tuesday's lesson, at least when I turn to Wednesday, I can quickly go to that hash symbol to get the main point that I want to bring out for that day to the class. Now, let's have a look here. So coming back to the beginning of the lesson, Joseph in Egypt, what is the main point of this lesson? Now, I don't know how you went, but for me, I'm reminded, it reminded me of this, that all things, that verse in Romans, all things work together for good to those that love God. And I'm reminded of how Joseph was not did not willingly go down into Egypt, but rather he was sold into slavery, and yet by his brothers, and yet he looked back upon it all as not evil, but as something that was good. It was something that was in the providence of God. And no matter what, regardless of all the trials he went through, the sufferings, the injustices, he looked upon everything as in the providence of God. And I think it's a wonderful attitude that he had. And this was in fact what the lesson was bringing out for me, how God calls us in his providence, not just directly, but in his providence, he calls us to be a witness for him. And let's have a look at how this was manifested in the life of Joseph. Firstly, the first section of the lesson brings out this main point, really, in a couple of verses here, the providence of God. Now, for me, what is providence? It's God's leading through the circumstances of our lives. That is, we don't hear him speaking directly, but in the way things pan out in the day or in our everyday activities, the way things pan out, we can see that, well, maybe God's hand is in this, not just maybe, but we do see God's hand in this because of the ultimate result of it was ended up being good, whereas when we were going through that various circumstances or trial, we were looking at it as something negative. So let's have a look at this section here, the providence of God. Firstly, we know that Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and after many years of not knowing what had come of him, his brothers make their way down to Egypt, and lo and behold, they realise after a series of events, they discover that the second in command of Egypt is in fact their brother who they sold many years before. And Joseph's attitude towards them at that time was remarkable. Joseph declared there, in the note brings out Genesis 45 verse 5, and this is what I'll be emphasising here, how despite the calamity, he did not have any ill will towards his brothers. He saw it as something that was good. He said it was God that sent him into Egypt, and it was all that God might preserve to him a posterity in the earth and save their lives by a great deliverance. And I like that as well. And that just reminds me of Jesus Christ himself, that he was but he was taken captive by the Romans, and he was cruelly abused and tortured, and yet he did it for that great good might come to all of us. That is a great deliverance. So a little parallel there between Joseph and the life of Christ. So looking at this section of the lesson, I would just emphasise also that that Joseph, by being taken down into Egypt, was and becoming holding such a prominent position there, God was able to use him as a light to all of the Egypt at that time, that they became to a knowledge of the true God of heaven. Now, question B is just bringing out the fact that where would Abraham's to be a blessing to all the nations around them, which God, this is what God ultimately wanted for Abraham's children, that they would be a blessing not just to Egypt but to all nations around them. They had to themselves become a great nation. That was part of the promise, and God saw that Egypt was an ideal place for that to happen. That is, for them to grow and multiply and become a great nation. And in fact, it's interesting how it's brought out here in the lesson, but also in the note, that God Egypt offered the conditions necessary to the fulfillment of the divine purpose. There was a section of country which was well watered, it was fertile, and open to the Israelites to settle there, Jacob's children to settle there. And they increased and multiplied and indeed became a great nation. But more importantly, as the note brings out, they were in such a place that they were preserved from the idolatry of Egypt, because the Egyptians didn't want to have anything to do with shepherds. To them, that was the lowest classes in their society. So they didn't want to have anything to do with them. A shepherd was an abomination. Genesis 46 verse 34 says the shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians. So they stayed clear of them. And this enabled the children of Israel to become relatively free from the influences initially of the idolatry of Egypt. So I'll just be emphasising that point as well. Now, under Monday's section, let's have a look at Joseph's successful service. Let's see what happened to Joseph when he went down into Egypt. And I see this whole section as a lesson in diligence, a lesson in faithfulness in little things. And let's have a look at this. Joseph was sold into slavery to a man by the name of Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was the captain of the king's guard, and Joseph was serving as a slave in his house. And while he was serving as a slave in the house, everything he put his hand to prospered. And this had an effect upon Potiphar. Potiphar looked and could see that Joseph was very faithful, very diligent, very careful, very shrewd, and very wise in the way he managed the affairs of the household. And it prospered. Potiphar's household prospered as a result. And Joseph himself, in serving in that house, the note there brings out, and I emphasise this, that he was not ashamed of the religion of his fathers, and he made no effort to hide the fact that he was a worshipper of Jehovah. So then why did everything prosper that Joseph put his hand to? I think it's brought out under B. This is what I'll be emphasising there. It says there that the Lord was with him, that is with Joseph. And it ended up that Potiphar made him, Joseph, overseer of his entire house. And it brings out in the note that this prosperity was not just the result of a direct miracle from God, but God cooperated with Joseph's in this work of all the duties that were entrusted to him. Joseph's industry, his care, his energy, they were crowned with divine blessing. So his industry, care and energy, Joseph attributed his success to the favour of God, and even his idolatrous master accepted this as the secret of his unparalleled prosperity. With steadfast, well-directed effort, however, success could never have been attained. That is, without steadfast, well-directed effort. So it's a lesson for us in our evangelism that without steadfast, well-directed efforts, we cannot expect success to accompany our labours. So we need to be diligent, to be careful, to apply energy and tact, wisdom and steadfastness and well-directed effort to all that we accomplish if we are to expect success from God. That's what I'll be bringing out there. Now, in regard to diligence itself, that principle of diligence, there's some wonderful promises in God's Word. And you'll see there that it says in Psalms is quoted, Psalms 1:1-3, Psalms 128 verse 1 and 2, Proverbs 12:24 and Proverbs 22:29. I mean, various ideas come through that I'll be emphasising that, the blessings to those who are diligent, who are faithful. They shall bear rule, they shall stand before kings, they shall be happy, and they'll eat the labour of their own hands. In other words, they'll be rewarded for their diligence. It's just the way God works. Remember, as the note brings out here, remember that the blessing of God rests upon unwearied diligence. So let us take that to heart. One talent wisely used will bring two to God. So I would just be emphasising this attribute of diligence and the attributes of industry, of care, of energy, that will always manifest in the life of Joseph. He just got stuck in, did what he did with care, with steadfastness, with diligence, and God blessed it all. So God will do the same thing for us. Now, looking under section number 3, Joseph's integrity. So not only was he a man of industry, of diligence, of steadfastness, and of energy and care, but he was also a man of integrity. So let's have a look at this section. The first question, 3a, asks us to recount what happened there when Joseph's integrity was tested. And we know we've got the experience there with Potiphar's wife. She made an approach to him, as I've already mentioned. And let me just bring up the verses there. That she looked upon Joseph, asked her to lie with him, but he refused. And I note how he refused and what his response was. That he said to his master, "Behold, my master wotteth not what is with me in the house. He has committed all that he has to my hand. There is none greater in this house than I, neither has he kept back anything from me but thee, because thou art his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against, and note who he sins against. He says here, he sinned against God. Joseph realized that he would not just be committing a sin against Potiphar, but against God himself. Such was his relationship that he had with the God of his fathers. Joseph worked as if in the very presence of God in everyday life. So his diligence and his faithfulness, his carefulness, his steadfastness, all that was applied with a conscious knowledge that he was doing this not just unto Potiphar or unto Potiphar's household, but unto God himself. And so too, when it came to this great test, he realized that if he were to succumb to the temptation that Potiphar's wife had offered to him, he would be sinning against God. So I really appreciated the witness that is for us, that Joseph's answer, as the note brings out here, reveals and I would emphasise this, it reveals the power of religious principle. He was a man that acted not from feeling, not from emotion, but a man of principle. He acted from principle. He would not betray the confidence of his master on earth, and whatever the consequences, he would be true to his master in heaven. Now that is a fundamental principle of Christianity. Whatever the consequences, to be true to our master in heaven, no matter what circumstances come our way. God will remember. God was working in our life constantly to bring together for good, to work all things out together for good to those that love Him. And our love is shown by our obedience to Him, by our faithfulness to Him, by our willingness to trust Him, no matter what happens, no matter what the consequences are. And this was the attitude of Joseph. His first thought was of God, as the lesson brings out there. What would this mean to God if I were to commit this great sin, great crime? So the next section of the lesson brings out here, despite his faithfulness to his master, we see that Potiphar listened to his wife and believed what she said. But the note also brings out that had Potiphar believed what his wife said, Joseph would have been killed. But instead, what happened? Well, as the note brings out, the verses bring out, Genesis 39 verse 20, we see there that he was placed in prison. Psalms 105 verse 7 and 18, not just in prison but in fetters and irons. So he was chained up as a result of the allegations brought against him. He was an innocent person accused of a crime and found guilty, and yet he was yet in all that he accepted the outcome, no matter what would happen. So he suffered for his integrity, as the note brings out there. He suffered for his integrity, and his tempter, for his tempter had revenged herself by accusing him of a foul crime. But notice this, Joseph. The reason why Joseph didn't lose his life was because of his character, the uprightness of his character. It wasn't just his words denying the charges, but Potiphar knew the character of the man who stood there accused. The modesty and uprightness that had uniformly characterized his conduct were proof of his innocence. That's a remarkable thought, that his character and his conduct prior to that were proof that he was innocent of this charge. In other words, it was so out of character that Potiphar could not believe that Joseph would have done that. And so too it may be with us, with you and I, that God wants us to be such a light for Him, that our character, our conduct will be a witness to those around us. They could not expect anything but good to come from us. But rather than accept, the witness of his own conscience, Potiphar banished Joseph to disgrace and bondage, as it says there in the note. And another interesting little highlight here, point C just brings this out, this highlight, that where was the prison? Now, it's not explicitly stated, but you can put two and two together here. We know that Potiphar was the captain of the king's guard, and also we know that the prison, it says there, or verse 39, Genesis 39 verse 1 says that Potiphar was the captain of the guard. And Genesis 41 verses 9 to 10, that Pharaoh had been wroth with the butler and baker and had put them in ward in the captain of the guard's house, both him and the chief baker. So if Potiphar was the captain of the guard and the baker and the butler were put in ward in Potiphar's house, and we find them there in this lesson, that there they are with Joseph, we understand that prison must have been part of the compound that made up Potiphar's household. And so Joseph wasn't that far from Potiphar, but yet he was still bound in prison there with others. So that's an interesting little highlight there. But notice what happens, though, while he's now in this situation. It's not brought out here, but the extra readings, which is taken from Patriarchs and Prophets, page 213 to 223, I noted on page 218 that Joseph, just as faithful as he was in Potiphar's house, so too was he in prison. And the keeper of the prison eventually placed Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. So faithful and industrious and honest he was. And I thought that was an interesting thought there. And so here he is in charge, showing great kindness and care and attention to the various prisoners. And two of them have a dream, the butler and the baker that once served in Pharaoh's court. And they approached Joseph, I should say, what am I saying Jacob for? Joseph, I should say, was there in charge of the prison. They approached Joseph, and he, not in charge of the prison, but in charge of the prisoners. The keeper of the prison obviously was in charge of the prison, but they approached Joseph with their dream, and Joseph interprets the dream. He points them once again to the fact that God is the one that can understand dreams. He says, "Do not interpretations belong to God?" That was the language that he used there to them. And so they told Joseph their dream. Joseph interpreted. The baker's dream was interpreted. The butler's dream was interpreted in a positive outcome from that interpretation. And the butler's dream was interpreted, but with a negative outcome. That is, the dreams spoke of the ultimate destiny of both those two captives. The butler was restored to the Pharaoh's court, and the baker unfortunately lost his life. But Joseph had reminded the butler, if you are restored to to the Pharaoh's court, remember me, how the favour I've done for you, and remember me to Pharaoh. Unfortunately, the butler didn't do that, and nevertheless, it was some years later where God was still working in His providence. The purposes of God know no haste and no delay. So when it comes to His purpose, He was working it all out according to His time frame. And one evening, on one occasion, He gave Pharaoh a dream. Pharaoh dreamed the dream. And this is how God was going to now get Joseph out of prison and into the position that He had purposed for him in the long run. So Pharaoh was given a dream, and he saw 7 fat cows, and 7 skinny cows, and the skinny cows ate the fat cows, but they were still skinny. So, and the 7 ears of corn, there were good corn on a stalk, so fat and full corn on a stalk, and then there were 7 ears of thin corn. Now, what did all this mean? Well, the butler remembered what the dream meant, and so God obviously put it into the mind of the butler to remember that there was a person who could interpret dreams, and the butler was able to mention Joseph to Pharaoh. So Joseph was brought before Pharaoh, and then the question B puts the question to us of how did Joseph call the attention now? So here's Joseph being pulled out of prison, and his faithfulness in his God is unshaken. He is not wavered one iota. And now we find him in Pharaoh's court, here before Pharaoh, and he says quite plainly, God has showed Pharaoh what he is about to do. So Joseph once again witnesses for God now, but here before Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. And we know the interpretation of the dream. We'll summarise the interpretation. You know what it was. It's there in Genesis 41, verse 26 to 31. I won't read it all, but in a nutshell, we know what was going to happen. There were going to be 7 years of plenty, and then there'll be 7 years of famine. And then Joseph gave some advice. Question C asked what the advice was, and we know what the advice was. And Joseph, now, I've sometimes wondered, did he have an ulterior motive in what he said? I don't believe he did. He just, in his own wisdom and own integrity and his own experience, knew what kind of person that it would require to manage the preparations for those 7 years of famine. It would first require someone who could make provisions for the first 7 years that would then be distributed in the second period of 7 years, that is the 7 years of famine. And he gave some advice there to Pharaoh, and I think it's brought out there. The advice he gave was to look out a man discreet and wise and set him over the land of Egypt, and let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land and take up the fifth part, or 20% of those of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years, and then let them gather all the food of those good years that come and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. And that food shall be for the store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt. The land perish not through the famine. So he was a man with prudence, shrewdness, forethought, a good judge of what was required. And, Pharaoh was not only amazed at the interpretation of the dream and what it meant, but just amazed that he was a man who had a plan already for it. Not that Joseph had the plan, but Joseph was so blessed. That was just his way of dealing with that situation. This is the best thing you can do to survive that situation. And Pharaoh, it's brought out there that in the note that Pharaoh saw. It was evident. It brings out the note here under question D. It was evident that a divine power was with Joseph, and that there were none among the king's officers of state so well qualified to conduct the affairs of the nation at this crisis, simply from the wisdom that he demonstrated in the plan that he came up with. And so, it led Pharaoh to say, can we find, as it says there in Genesis 41:38, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And so Pharaoh said, for as much as God has showed you all this, there is none so discreet and wise as you are. You shall be over my house. And he placed Joseph in charge of this project. Joseph became the second in charge, in fact, over all of Egypt. So wonderful was the providence of God in Joseph's life. From a boy sold into slavery to become the chief of a household, to once again find himself in prison, and then to be taken from the prison and put upon the mountaintop of influence and responsibilities. So this is the wonderful workings of God. But in all of this, I'd be emphasising this point that it was not just by chance that happened to Joseph. It was God knew the material he was working with. And it was the character development that was essential for Joseph to be able to handle the situations he would come up against as the second in charge in Egypt there. So I'd be emphasising that point as well to my class, that God, why he delays in working out his plans for us is because he also allows time for us to develop character. And that's what I would emphasise there. Joseph developed a character of industry, of care, of diligence, of integrity, and of faithfulness, and he was blessed with wisdom. He had certain talents. Not all of us have the talents that Joseph would have manifested, but we all can develop the traits of character he manifested. And then as we do, God will bless us in our activities as we're carrying forward our duties in his name. That he will bring success, as it said there in that previous section under Mondays, that steadfast, well-directed effort with industry, care, and energy will be attended with success. So, looking now in our last section of the lesson for this week, section number 5, just looking at Joseph as a worthy example. As we look at his experience, one of the first lessons that we can learn, and it's brought out there in Luke 16 verse 10, that he that is faithful in much, rather he that is faithful in little will be faithful in much. He that is unjust in the least is also unjust in much. So it's about being faithful in the little things. As it says there in the note, paying attention to duty in every station, from the lowliness to the most exalted. This had been training. Joseph had been training every power for its highest service. So by faithful attention in those little things in life, and that's what we need to realise. By adherence to principle in the transactions of ordinary life, the mind becomes accustomed to hold the claims of duty above those of pleasure and inclination. So I'd be emphasising that to my students as well. That there are some people today, when you put the meal out and you've got dessert there, or you've got a nice thing on the plate, some children will eat all their veggies first and then have the nice thing afterwards. Some others have the nice item of food first and then eat the not so things that they don't enjoy so much afterwards. But God wants us to fulfill our duties first rather than pleasure and inclination, and he will then bless us with success beyond our measure, beyond our comprehension, I should say. So minds thus disciplined are not wavering between right and wrong, like the reed trembling in the wind. They are loyal to duty because they have trained themselves to habits of fidelity and truth. By faithfulness in that which is the least, they acquire strength to be faithful in greater matters. So this was the lessons that Joseph was learning, those lessons of faithfulness, of industry, of integrity, of diligence. They're the lessons that God wants you and I to learn, and especially our young people, because they are the future of God's church on earth. They are the future ones who God will use to be a light for him in this world. And we need to learn these lessons today, that God can attend our efforts with his blessing and thus bring success as we seek, or as we, in his providence, are placed in those positions where we become a light for the world as Joseph was. So just summarising, it is in the providence of God that he calls many people, and we just need to maintain our faithfulness and integrity and trust in him, regardless of where that providence takes us. It may lead us through calamity, it may lead us through bright spots, through prosperity, but wherever it leads us, remember it is that all things work together for good to those that love God. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation this week. If you have, please pass it on, because I'd like to share this with as many people as possible in our Sabbath schools around the world, so that we all gain some help in understanding how to best present this lesson. So till next week, take care, God bless you, and enjoy your study of the Sabbath Bible lessons in our Sabbath school this week. Take care, God bless. Bye for now.